New CPUs are awesome, with recent releases such as the original Zen microprocessor architecture, which is actually getting on a bit now, actually, coming to think of it, which doubled the mainstream core counts, but perhaps most importantly, actually proved AMD could be a viable contender against Intel. And speaking of Intel, Alder Lake has proven that Intel will remain a threat to AMD, providing they can get their execution on point. There have been also a number of other exciting releases that I'm not mentioning here, such as Zen 2, which brought, well, chiplets, and that kind of was a big deal. But let's just all be blunt, honest with ourselves. CPUs are great, but for gamers anyway, it's all about the GPU, the graphics card, with two architectures really just stealing a ton of limelight in the tech news right now. Nvidia's Lovelace, aka RTX 40, and AMD's RDNA 3, which is probably going to be RX 7000. In this video then, we're going to be focusing on a ton of RDNA 3 confirmations and some updates to specifications, not just from what others have said, but also reaching out to my own sources. There's a lot of stuff to get through here and a lot of, well, let's just say interesting information. And of course, we're going to get right into it after this message from the video's sponsor.
If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices.
As regular viewers know, there have been a ton of reported specifications for RDNA 3, particularly when we're talking about the flagship N31. Early reports seem to indicate that it had 2 GCDs, which would split the 15,000-ish ALUs equally. But this, of course, was somewhat revised with a single GCD and 6 MCDs. I think I was about the first person to report that we were only looking at a single GCD configuration and their 6 MCDs, so I'd like to actually just spend a moment before we get into the rest of the information to clarify a few points, as I'm still getting a ton of emails, DMs, and requests to kind of explain that situation just a little bit more. As a brief summary for those who missed that other information, 2 GCDs were possibly never ever planned, even in the very earliest design phase. The other possibility was that there were 2 GCDs planned, but basically AMD just couldn't get them working correctly with graphics. But they could get them working for computers. It's less complicated. There's a plethora of reasons for this. It can be latency, inter-chip communications, and so on and so on. I've gone over this previously, but basically speaking, I have heard that there are 2 GCDs planned for a potential Radeon Pro Duo. I've already leaked this, and it seems to be based on N32. Grayman has also reported that we could see a dual GCD gaming card in the future. I've had a single source tell me maybe on this, but they've basically added that it would require quite an overhaul of the RDNA 3 architecture, basically some type of refresh to fix the aforementioned issues. Now, I don't know whether this is true or not. Personally speaking, I am leaning towards AMD have always planned RDNA 3 to be a single GCD, because ultimately this GPU seems to be designed around area efficiency and just overall, well, efficiency for die space and a ton of other things, and you'll get why later on, and it makes even more sense when we're discussing mobile SKUs. With that said, I do not have like a spy camera in Lisa Su's office, and this is a guesstimate. As for dual GCDs in the future, for example RDNA 4, honestly, it's too early to discuss that with any great deal of certainty. I've had a ton of mixed information, some sources insisting that it's going to be a single GCD for RDNA 4, however, a couple of my other good sources have told me it's going to be multi-GCD, so I honestly just don't know at this point. But let's get into the good stuff. Website Angstronomics, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, have recently published a very intriguing article. I'll leave, of course, a link in the video description. This details much of the N31, 32 and 33 information, and while some of this does go over what I've previously leaked, in fact there have been quite a lot of confirmations here of what I've personally put out, which actually makes me quite happy, but importantly there are some numerous additional bits of information, chiefly the Infinity cache sizes as well as the actual die sizes of the various SKUs. And obviously this is really interesting. There are also a couple of other nice oddities as well. So the website itself does a really nice job going over this stuff, and again I'll leave a link in the video description. I'd encourage you guys to check it out after you've watched this video, but I didn't just want to echo what they'd said and then said, well yeah, that matches up with my previous information. I decided to also reach out to some of my sources. And basically speaking, I did a lot of digging to find out whether what, they'd mentioned was true, as a lot of it did match up with what I'd said previously, but I was particularly interested in the, Infinity cache size, and you'll get why in just a moment, as they're really small, and yes, that's what she said. But, yeah, just, my weekend was a little bit crazy, to be honest with you. I've been doing a ton of tidying up and clearing out and all that other stuff. And not to mention the fact that on one of the days I was kind of having a retro gaming thing with a couple of friends, and we're playing Sega Saturn, Virtua Fighter 2, Street Fighter Alpha 2 and 3, and goodness knows what else, and suddenly I feel really, really old. But anyway, I want to talk about this stuff because I find it really intriguing. So without further ado, there is just one other thing that I would like to kind of get out of the way, and that's actually regarding legacy compute units. So, I know I'll get a ton of confusion and comments if I don't mention this, but Angstronomics mentions Legacy CU. I've used it several times in the past, and we're not the only leakers who have said this, but honestly, the term itself is not 100% technically accurate. Because while some people do want the CU number as well as the workgroup processor number, in brief summary, the number of shaders per workgroup processor has essentially doubled from 128 to 256. And basically, while RDNA 2 did a lot to enforce workgroup processor over CU as a performance measurement, RDNA 3 turns this up even more, to the point where discussion of CU is basically just not even worth it. I will include the specs here because it's still common to do so, but just TLDR, or TL didn't listen, I suppose. One workgroup processor for RDNA 2 has 128 ALUs, and finally, RDNA 3 workgroup processor sports 256. Now, let's start with N31. You can see yourself that their specifications are pretty similar to what have been floating around the internet, with a couple of exceptions. So let's go through these specifications, shall we, from Angstrom. The first, of course, is one single GCD. Now this measures 308 mm squared, so it's great that we actually finally have a measurement. It's built on TSMC's N5 process. We also have 6 MCDs in either a 0 or 1 high configuration. We'll get to that in just a second. But these MCDs are produced on the TSMC N6 process and measures 37.5 mm squared. 48 workgroup processors, 12,288 ALUs, 6 shader engines, and 12 shader arrays. Infinity cache is 96, I'm going to repeat that, 96 megabytes for 0 high, and 192 megabytes for 1 high. So this basically means that if it's stacked, in other words, you can just think V-cache for the sake of this video for simplicity's sake, that's a 1 high configuration, because you've got the base, which is 0, and then you've got another one on top, which is the 1 high. Now you can see that a lot of these specs are quite close to my own specs in this comparison, but with major differences being the Infinity cache. I had been told it was 192 or 384, but a single source quite some time ago, when I asked them, is it 192, he said, yeah, that's close enough. So I was taking that as confirmation it was 192, which it technically is, but that seems to be stacked. I was also told by them that it's much smaller than 384, and generally RDNA 3's caches are much smaller than you may think. Now I've got the reasons behind this in a second, because basically I was very skeptical when I heard just 96 megabytes. I mean, that's actually smaller than N31, but I've spoken to several sources now, And I won't repeat what a couple of them told me verbatim, but bottom line is I'm very certain that Astronomics information is pretty damn accurate. Basically, the caching system of RDNA 3 is much smarter and more efficient than its predecessor. Cutting a long story short, it's more efficient in data storage, doesn't duplicate as much data, and has very tight integration, as you guys know, with the GDDR6 memory bus. So the memory bus of N31 offers between 864 gigabytes per second to 1 terabyte. This depends on what the final memory figures will end up being. I've heard everything from 18 GBps to 21. I think 21 is correct, but I'm going to give both figures here. According to a single source though, I'm trying to get this confirmed by someone else, in best case scenarios the cache can be 3 times as efficient, space-wise, i.e. 96 megabytes of Infinity Cache for RDNA 2 could be equaled with just 32 for RDNA 3, although of course with any of this stuff it's not always the case. Now I also want to add, and this is somewhat going off topic of N31, so you can skip a few seconds if you would like, but I would also like to add that this is incredibly intriguing when it comes to future APUs. I was told that Phoenix is very small, it's around 160 mm². I'm trying to get that confirmed with another source, but either way, APUs in the future, you guys can just imagine how they could crank up the number of workgroup processors. And even with, modestly clocked DDR5 memory on a, notebook, a laptop, whatever, and certainly a desktop, we could start to see some very impressive performance results, especially with, say, 16 megabytes of Infinity Cache produced in this manner. It's going to be very interesting to see how AMD ends up, playing out all of these different things. Like, again, a little off topic, but it's really interesting because, AMD's products, they are singing harmoniously. So, for example, you can look at what their work is on the data center, or CPUs, or GPUs, or desktop APUs, and, so on and so on. And you can start to really get a picture of how one piece of technology is benefiting another piece of technology and how they can bolt all of these different techs together depending on the scenario. It's very interesting, and honestly, while AMD doesn't have the marketing budget and certainly the research budget of, say, Nvidia and Intel and so on, although they are increasing those budgets, it's basically what I'm trying to tell you guys is that they're being very smart with the engineering talent. I guess that's kind of the summary. I've already mentioned several times in the past that MCDs act as both memory controllers, each handling 2 RAM chips, basically, as well as being the Infinity Cache. So according to this newest information, there are 6 MCDs, which we did know, but the capacity is much smaller. It's 16 megabytes, and times 6, of course, equals 96 megabytes total. So according to this information, there is basically Vcache stacking available. I was 50-50 whether this was true. I believe it was Grayman who mentioned this initially, but yeah, my information I was 50-50 on. I kept hearing different things, but Astronomics have now confirmed it. The benefits, however, of a 1-high stack, in other words, the MCD with additional cache bolted on top, doesn't seem to be that much for gaming, and you can also see that, again, the GCD and the MCDs are pretty small. Now, I also want to mention TDP figures, because TDP, of course, is a very important topic. I've also been given several variable figures, actually, for the TDP of N31, and this could be because it's skew dependent, some of the information could be incorrect, or it could just be that AMD are just trying to optimize, and I certainly think clock frequencies and TDPs are not locked down right now. The earliest figure I was given is 375 watts, but more recently 405. This seems to be for the reference design, but I've heard AIBs can go up to 450, possibly 500 watts. I'm very skeptical on 500 watts. Maybe that's like the overclocked power limit. So for example, stonks, it's 450. And then if you, like crank up the power limits and all of that stuff, then it can go up to 500 watts. I'm not too certain. I'm giving both 450 and 500. I'm sure one of them is wrong, obviously, but I'm just not sure which. So I'm providing both here. And then of course, hopefully we'll get some clarification pretty soon. I also want to add that 3 GHz or more seems very doable from N31. I've actually heard that 3.2 GHz is achievable, but whether that's from the vast quantity of silicon or whether that's like, you know, creme de la crop, I don't know. I've also been told that the information that Astronomics, Jesus, I can't speak, has regarding 42 workgroup processor 320-bit version, which is a cut-down variant, of course, is actually correct. That's from a single source. The inevitable question I'm sure folks will ask in the comments is, what about performance? How does this thing compare to NVIDIA? And the answer is, honestly, no one is 100% certain yet, and there are several reasons. For one, even NVIDIA, which are further along in the production, in other words, they've actually given, say, GA102 samples to AIBs, are not 100% locked in. How many different configurations, how many different clock frequencies have they had for RTX 4090? And it's not that these figures have been wrong, for example, from Kopite7 Kimi or others. It's just that NVIDIA are testing things internally. Even the RTX 4080, it started out at, what was it, 420 watts, then it went down to 320, and recently, I put out a video about this recently, I've been told that there are actually custom BIOSes, or NVIDIA are testing, or possibly it could be the retail silicon has multiple different versions. It's not clear yet, but 320, 350, and 380 watts seem to also be being tested internally, and possibly will have at least 2 variants at launch. And Kopite7 Kimi also mentioned that as well, that possibly there will be 2 variants of this, maybe the reference designs, and then like an overclock variant. It's too hard to know. And what makes it even more confusing, of course, is that how are we even comparing the performance? Are we talking raster? Are we talking ray tracing? Are we talking FP32? And also because even NVIDIA themselves have locked down their drivers so much, for example, Time Spy Extreme might run, but you try to run Doom Eternal and it will just error. It just will not work, so that it's really difficult. I think, and I'm really just not certain about this, my guesstimate so far is that NVIDIA probably will be a little faster than AMD, but that is a pure guess. I do not have benchmark numbers from N31. Hopefully this changes pretty soon. I've been told that there will be a lot more information in the next couple of weeks for RDNA 3. But more importantly, there are other considerations. What about manufacturing costs? What about production? What about availability? What about heat? What about power consumption? All of these different things obviously play into whether or not you want the card, and also the software, the drivers. You get the idea. So, for example, if NVIDIA are, let's say, 10% faster, as an example, but they cost, I don't know, $1,800 for the 1490, and then you have, the highest end N31 SKU costs $1,500, but again, it's 10% slower. That's down to you. I don't personally think the RTX 4090 is going to be that expensive, but again, I'm just giving it an example. I'm going to blast through N32 because, well, I think there's less really that's surprising here. Basically, it's GFX 1101, Wheat NAS, 1 single GCD, which is actually smaller, of course, because it has fewer workgroup processors and other stuff, so it's only 200 mm², 4 MCDs. There is no stacking here on this one, just because it wasn't worth it in terms of cost. But again, the MCDs are identical as N31. Nothing really to discuss. 30 workgroup processors, 3 shaders arrays. Infinity cache is 64 megabytes. As I mentioned, there is no stacking. 256-bit GDDR6. The Infinity bus for N32, as I said, is 256, but I've also been told from my own information, I've got a single source at the moment, I'm trying to clarify this with someone else, there is also 192-bit and 160-bit variants as well, and I've already put out some potential other SKUs and specifications for AMD's lineup. Now, it's not clear, to be honest with you, how AMD will segment these cards, but you can imagine that it's going to go down to around 20 workgroup processors, I imagine, for N32, given the number of workgroup processors for N33 starts at 16. So I'll probably want to at least have maybe 2 to 3 SKUs based on N32. So N32 will also have mobile parts. I've been told the specs are quite close to the desktop, obviously with some changes like clock frequency. But yeah, this is going to be a mainstream product. Now, what's quite interesting about N32 is it seems to launch last. So N31 is going to launch basically November-ish, and early next year we're going to have N33, but this card, or rather cards based on N32, they're going to launch some point next year. I think it's probably going to be like the second half of the year, but that's a guesstimate. I don't have any solid information. And AMD have changed their launch plans a few times at this point, mostly because of GPU inventory, oversupply. And that, of course, has impacted NVIDIA. And obviously, it's also impacting AMD. I don't really need to talk about that too much because we all know about it. Hey baby, do you want to see my hot pink bonefish? Of course you do. So N33 is monolithic. This has, of course, been something we've known for quite some time. 16 workgroup processors, 4096 ALUs, 2 shader engines. Infinity cache is 32 megabytes, which is very titchy. 128-bit GDDR6, and of course it's monolithic, so it's produced on a TSMC N6 process and is about 200 mm². Now, as far as I personally understand, N34 is not going to happen. I had mixed sources whether it was ever planned, but my current understanding is that N34 is just not going to launch. Why? Well, it really comes down to the fact that AMD want to push their APUs for lower performance parts. So, for example, you've got Phoenix or whatever, and of course their CPUs like Ryzen 7000. Well, those suckers have an iGPU anyway, and obviously Intel's parts do, so basically speaking, if you need a little more grunt, you would go with an APU. If you don't need the grunt at all, you would go with, just a standard CPU if you're just doing like Windows-based crap, TD crap. And of course, if you need tons of graphical performance, you've got N33 or above. And I personally feel that this does make sense. Who knows though, maybe N34 will eventually come out, or they'll release an even lower end N33 part. Yeah, we've known for quite some time that it leverages the TSMC 6nm process. Lower configurations of N33, I've been told, go down to just 96-bit. I believe that's 14 workgroup processors, although I've only got a single source that's confirmed this to me. Performance will roughly be the same, by the way, as N31. I believe they're comparing that against the 6900 XT. It could be the 6800 XT. Obviously, there are several parts based on N21. However, I believe it is based on 6900 XT. I've been told performance is roughly going to be even, based on a ton of different metrics. Obviously, it could be, are we talking about, 1440p, 1080p, 4K, ray tracing on or off, what games, tons of other questions like the API. We honestly don't know, but bottom line, guys, I suspect that it's going to be quite close, give or take. I've also been told that the mobile parts are really close to the desktop in terms of performance, and yeah, I think that it's definitely going to be a very interesting one, because one of my sources has also said that in terms of efficiency, GA104 is actually really efficient on mobile, because obviously, when you're going with lower clock frequencies, power requirements go down a lot. And one thing NVIDIA does have, technically speaking, is a process advantage. So it's going to be very interesting to see GA104 versus N33. Of course, there are other, things that we need to take into consideration, like cost and other things too, but it's going to be very interesting. Power supply and memory capacity. Again, I want to stress, guys, mass production has not started. These figures could change, or could have been incorrect, or the information could be old, for example, three weeks old, and the figures have changed since then. But just to echo what I said a moment ago, 375 to 405 watts for reference for N31, and AIB's 450, possibly 500, I'm not sure. N32 mobile, basically 135 to 170 watts, but the N33 SKUs, they're probably going to be 60 watts to 150. Again, I'm not 100% confident in this information. It's only from, at the moment, a single source. I'm waiting for someone else to verify it, so hopefully I can provide more kind of clarification in the next few days. Now, as for the memory capacity, I'm sure a lot of you have been following along with this, have seen that N33 is 8 gigabytes, N32 doubles this, and then N31 is going to basically be 24 gigabytes. Now, what I'd been told initially is that the amount of RAM doubles essentially for the prosumer variant. So in short, if you're going and purchasing like one of the Radeon Pro cards, you can get like N33 with 16 gigabytes, but again, that is not available for gaming. I've had a source that's basically given me an info dump, and they've told me that there potentially will be plans for AMD to allow the higher memory configurations. Again, the rest of the specs, as far as I understand, remain the same. The only difference is the quantity of memory, not the speed or whatever. But I have heard that AMD may allow AIBs to basically go with the higher memory capacity for, say, N33, so there could be a gaming variant N33 that has 16 gigabytes of memory. I'm not really sure how that's going to work, because typically, to my understanding anyway, AMD have in the past sold the memory as well as the GPU and a few other bits as essentially kits, so you don't just, you know, procure your own RAM. Basically, AMD helps you with that. But again, it wouldn't be the first time that AMD or Nvidia have provided freedom and flexibility to AIBs, and it seems to really vary based on generation to generation to generation, what they decide to do here. We know that Nvidia's approach to AIBs, for example, has changed quite a lot over the past like 5-6 generations. Like, you guys can just, especially if you compare it to the kind of older GeForce cards, like it almost felt like the wild west. I would like for 16 gigabyte gaming cards on N33 because I think, you know, extra RAM is great. But that said, who knows? It's going to be an interesting one. I think, though, that's just about it for this video. There are some other things that I was going to go into, but honestly, this video is already getting much longer and kind of weightier than I'd hoped, to be honest. I have a ton of other bits that I'd like to go into for some console-related stuff. I actually have some pretty big updates for the Switch, as well as an Xbox Portable, memory stuff for Xbox Series S, and some other bits. So that's going to be in maybe a couple of videos. So yeah, of course, stick with us. Hopefully, though, you have enjoyed this one. Again, full credit to Astronomics for these updates. You can check them again in the link below. And I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.